당은 기부진다 투모에 남기린 비게 내시도 다 내기가 수당은 이제 안실래 신고해야지 다 예침보다 가르치는 건 저기 네 동화된바 세야지 대신 안에 동화된바 세야지 신고고로 디자인도 동화된바디 하고 같이 내가 거의 동화 타달래 님보민도 샘피게 통해도 되네 되래 님보메 봐도 되래 타르게 삼바기 되네 되래 탈베 탈바든이 삼바기 고고로 되네 자디 탈바든이 삼바기에 된다라 응가르스는 코와를 님보메 봐 통고고래 지상 코와 님보메 봐 통하나 거의 괜디에 네 괜디에 가나가나 요바데 하고 고고로 되네 자당 좀 맞으랴 아니지게 기회 갑라 내가나가래 동아 요아레스 데 기회 동아 된데 시어레 괜을 봐서나 된데 요아레스 그 생각도 다 디고 쉬사와레.
Good evening. So we're continuing to look at the trainings that are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity. And we're starting to look at the Four Noble Truths. And we're looking at the first, the true sufferings. So the true sufferings the Buddha taught are important to know. And what one needs to come to recognize is how pervasive suffering is. But not just the coarser elements that we recognize easily, but the subtler elements and things that we do not even otherwise recognize as suffering. So that we come to recognize that there is no happiness to be found within samsara that is worthy of placing our hopes in. When we come to really know suffering, we'll want to know, how does it come about? What can I do about this? So we'll seek out the origins of suffering, the causes for our predicament. And to seek out those causes of our predicament, this follows from having come to know true sufferings, but also to know that we can gain freedom from them. So this is what we are looking at. So we're going to continue with the second of the Eightfold Division of Suffering, the suffering of aging, the middle page 159.
디기 마싱 비긴 용거로 디네자 안주 개와세데 간에 요래 기회 갑리야 강하가래 용거를 가서 접치 주바래 아디네 안주게 가위 동아 상주 진행하는 주게 아주 기에네마 가주가 개주고레스 지사 디네식 디네게 괜찮아로 가래 용거를 해서지 안주게 두시네 디고 쉬어야 자다 디네 가위 동아 세드 마쉬야래 지사 가위 동아 세드 시에다 가위 만족 개도도 간다간다 주고 교행 가르가르도 간다간다 만족의 풍부에 내다 리뷰에 내다한테 딱 뭐를 지간이도 세베게다 하고 얘기 된다라 만족이 걸 다시 가위 내다 동아이 걸마 주고를 받아.
We started to look at the Eightfold Presentation of suffering last time in order to wake us up from this delusion, this confused ignorance, whereby we misperceive our reality, thinking that there is happiness to be found within cyclic existence, not recognizing how the very fundamentals of what has established our samsaric existence is our very cause for suffering. And we need to wake up to the reality of our lived experience, seeing what it truly is, so as to give rise to this determined attitude to gain freedom from it. And because we are not guided by this determined attitude for freedom, because that's not our driving force behind everything that we do, this has come about because we haven't yet really recognized suffering. So we started last week we're looking at the first of the 8, the suffering of birth. Tonight we come to we start with the second, the suffering of aging. So with each of these sufferings, one needs to come to know the entity of it. So what is the entity, or what it is meant by it, what its very essence, so what is meant by the suffering of aging. And this includes coming to recognize its results, how suffering follows from aging.
Niba gawi dunga sambalas ngale serdane. Tene garasne delea yawal masona pa kheba chene pa samdana dele ngayores. Adamo kharesne su sambo yoso nyamba nis keba shudar kupa dang. Anu go Travis Travis medo da garwa. Trawa ane 제된 다른 예매 캬바 소지 나소 냠데 미두버 유아오.
So reading from the middle of page 159, the suffering of aging, contemplating the suffering of aging has 5 points. So the first of the 5, your attractive body completely deteriorates such that your spine becomes curved like a bow, your head becomes white like edelweiss, your forehead becomes covered in wrinkles like a cutting board, and so on. Thereby, your youth deteriorates and you become ugly.
Lama to Chagores, Kudu Lama to Chagores, Senating on Zuki Pungu Jueres or Tatiniki Jueres, Carson Diso, and the Judan Kim Mebala Gigo, Judan Kienlet in the Yungore, Sesanti or Another Garson, Subudigitina, Jetongu, Kugumacha, Kuruan, Di Majivachi, and Kodus in the Koran, Kurchine, Pai, Maguchin, Charter Waters, Guru Waters, Yakudu Lama to Che, Tinin, Dusin to Waters. Geshe Thubten Gayu Dungarwa, Gayu Dua Sambangadua, Su Sambo Yonso Nyambani, Geshe Thubten said.
Your attractive body completely deteriorates. So first of all, your attractive body. So this is talking about, or the way we approach this is looking at our body. And so our attractive body completely deteriorates such that your spine becomes curved like a bow. So what's presented here, and will continue to be presented, is this process of decline that comes with aging. And that this comes about is something that is dependent on causes. So because the causes have been accumulated, results such as one's physical deterioration, one's spine becoming curved like a bow, this is certain to follow.
That is what Bendigo shadow thing that is the Tongor Wadane, Gango Chado, Gusha Yakudu, Lama to Mongor Wadene.
What's presented here is the general signs of aging. So these are visible to us. It's not something that is completely hidden to us, that one loses the brightness of youth and starts to decline.
Ma Gusha go Sosugi, Tibetan, Namgina, and the Digitone, Chavachungurva, and Geshe Namu Guju, and the Gugu Charter, and the Mukoduja, which is Ranwajo and the Gugu Nunu, and she that just gave a Shudokuba city that the Negi and it's shared that, and Gione, she was Gitani, she wore it.
Certainly, it's very common that as one ages, one's spine becomes curved like a bow. So certainly, the way individuals age, there will be a difference. For some of these signs are shown much younger, others much later, if at all. So we're talking here in general, but certainly for most, as life continues, then physical signs such as this occur. So this isn't a presentation to look at and say, oh, this is mistaken because, for example, in my case, my spine has not become curved like a bow, or someone that I know this hasn't happened, or perhaps someone who's passed, it never happened for them. So the presentation here is talking in general. Not every point is pervasive. Not every point applies equally to everyone. The lines start out with your attractive body. So this is referring to the vigor and brightness and energy of youth, that this declines. The rate of decline will vary, but certainly it declines. Coming to the point whereas when one's young, you can jump up and about with lots of energy, but not after that long is it difficult just to stand up. One needs to make a concerted effort to get up. And further signs of aging, and the text continues, your head becomes white like edelweiss. So here, this is the process of aging, shown through the changing in the hair color. In particular, if you think of dark hair changing quite quickly to graying hair, and eventually the hair becomes completely white.
Nyamde miduba yuwa chizidang to the Pegol Party Nyama Mumbucha, who is only the Niki Nyama Mumbucha, the Dusin Chayan de Dene, and Subuga Lanso de Pa Chi Nimba Yushidus Miduba, then Chikungo as Miduba yuwa was it.
Further signs of physical aging. Your forehead becomes covered in wrinkles like a cutting board. So here too, a very clear sign of aging. And this is something that not many people will welcome, that these visible signs of their decline are so apparently are so easy to identify.
Anzu Ludelia, Dapa Timbuyo Mares, Cesati, Tangbo Yakoshana Dusun, Gurche, Ning Yakumeva Chargin, Tangbo Millet, Toyagi, Zebor Toy, this Gurchin, the Nichi, and Milia Maziva Chai, Charugo, Duatores, Chetan Gurugores, and this Chixung or Wadanala, this Gurche, Tangbo and the Shuban, the Ara Mevache, Dilling War Gurche, and the Shandum. So
the recognition here is that the situation of our body is not at all stable or reliable. We may have the wish to remain attractive, but we cannot sustain that. Against our wishes, our body ages and declines. We may not want to get old, but it happens, and we are powerless to stop it. So our vigor and energy that we once had, it does not remain, it cannot remain, and we are unable to prevent this process of aging and decline. The purpose of this reflection is, again, to break us out of this confusion, this delusion about our lived existence, to recognize that our body will naturally decline. And this cannot be prevented. And we need to recognize this to the point where we recognize that there is no abiding essence in this body that we can thereby ensure that the body does not decline. So despite our very best efforts over many years, this body will decline. And the purpose of coming to recognize this is so that we give rise to the determined attitude to achieve something better. So not take what we have now as good enough or as good as it necessarily can be. So to give rise to a wish to gain liberation from this contaminated state of samsara. We're looking actually at the second in the Eightfold Presentation of Suffering. What I mentioned a couple of weekends ago was the most common presentation, the threefold presentation of suffering. So this, looking at the suffering of aging, is not an illustration, although on the courses of levels it is, the suffering of physical and mental pain. It's rather an illustration, or it's rather to utilize this reflection to come to an understanding of the third type of suffering, all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. So again, these three types of sufferings, the suffering of physical and mental pain, which is the most apparent to us. The second type is much subtler and requires some deep reflection to recognize the suffering of transient happiness. But it's the third type of suffering that is most important, all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. So when we reflect on the suffering of aging, we utilize it to come to a deeper understanding or deeper recognition of all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. So when the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, and he taught the first, and he said the truth of suffering needs to be known. When the Buddha taught that the truth of suffering needs to be known, he was particularly referencing the third suffering, all-pervasive suffering of conditionality.
Dana, Shinza, Namdo, Dumbatan, Java, Mana, Deepjing, Drona, and Bubaso, Jeba was.
So the suffering of aging is 5 points. That was the first. Now the second. Power and strength deteriorate such that when you sit down, you look like a sack of soil when the rope holding it is cut. When you get up, you look like tree roots being uprooted. When you speak, you babble incoherently. And when you walk, you hobble and so on.
제다단 먼저 그 신신 갑라 안에 바이치 라이나 랑디고 마되나 되보라지 기셰베나 카데게 찔리디기 벤 직갓 야고 치도야 연구로와 이전에 바 게로도 가르쳐고서는 바 돕쇼더니 류기 돕 숭디인 바 냠로도 안에 마되베 갑라 안에 사게 차바다 자와서도 이게 세상한 중에 되는게 ben에 제다 되는 잠바다 되는 루시베 도도로지 되는 나 잘라로지 대야 남려야 두신 다샤 요베나 마 타고도 마 체셔나 코마 독신 자로마 gelisi 사이마로 독신 마 사이로와 온디나시 만족이 로겐고라 차이도 마 되리가라 틀레시 되리고 말데 마 독신 숙시 되고 그래서 디 건조게 가지고 루톱 냠베게다 괴레서 오다 네
When one's in one's youth, then descriptions like this seem almost impossible. But as we age, such decline becomes abundantly apparent. As our power and strength deteriorates, when we sit, as we aging and our strength is waning, then sitting down we become like when one has been carrying a heavy sack and finally one gets a chance to put it down, one will drop it with a bang. And this is how we tend to fall into a chair when we've walked perhaps only a short distance. But because of our declining power and strength, this is how we now sit, without grace, without gentleness, because of our lack of strength.
Dönpadan drawasi dang zui shingi zawadi ya yan sal ya duen je ya ge di nyu ro gong bo ro ka la wo wa ya de ko ma sal ma su gi ma do sa gang ya duen je ge di ni ge di ka la wo wa de ka le di na shin ya lang wi ka la pe ya lang ya le ya chi dang ba chi ma chi la ba ma bi je de chi den ya la ya le su yang si si hop de lang ma do ji du shin ne chi ge lang wo re se 지사데 야랑야래 갈래 요래서다 간지 양의 가시는 라버는 야 텐테 아니 야 텐의 야랑고야 가시양지 소소라 라버 마살이야 주신 두신 슈그라 잡시 랑고 지사 야랑야래 갈래 하버레스 이 갈래 하버 차데 가르스는 숙도 냠바데 또 냠도 버레스 냠베기 인자디 차고레제.
And it's not only when we slump down into a chair do we do so without the grace of youth, but it's the same when we try to stand up. When you get up, you look like tree roots being uprooted. And this is imagery showing the difficulty with which one rises from being seated as one's power and strength decline. It's no longer the smooth motion of our youth, but we need to push ourselves up with our hands. Later, as the decline continues, we probably need to be helped up. So this too is something that we observe.
파도도 공부하지 저는 직바 리아다 되게 도시네 응고레스 지난디 수도 년비 교레스 지난에 경고 차도 되게 주신주가블 기세세 되게 봐 교고 시도야다 기기리게 세월 응고로와 인경고라 차도에는 기세디 파도스 뉴뉴다 되니 봐 직사 다보라 매진 제레 야보라 제마도야 되는 응고레스 지자디 디 콜루도 년비 교레스 지난다 조유가블이야 남자 리쇼쇼다 마 dine yungo res. Jesa dine za ko ludo nyembi yun res.
Furthermore, when you speak, you babble incoherently. So this, sometimes we also recognize that as people age, their way of talking is quite different from when they were younger. That their speech isn't so clear. And this is due to the lack of power and strength in their mouth and their tongue, and therefore they do not speak as well as they did when they were younger. And then the text concludes with, and when you walk, you hobble and so on. So as one ages, one is no longer able to move around with vigor and energy. One sits down like a sack. One rises with difficulty. And when one walks has to walk slowly, because and one is unstable, therefore needing to concentrate so as not to fall over.
Wongpo nyamba de karasne melo sobo so salwar mi dongwa dang ane jenge chewa so ye dembalo soba ane tu jiwa hos.
Then the third point, the faculties deteriorate such that your eyes and so forth do not clearly perceive forms and so forth anymore, and the strength of your memory and so forth diminish as you grow forgetful and so forth.
예산당 간주기 미기게 세부 메통아 아니 메통아 차이도 미 원보의 냠르고 거래 세부 메통아 아니 미라 소베게 수소사와 메통아 아니 나위 암주기 자 세부 먹어와라 소바다 얘네게 아니 지 조용도 갑라 지레게 조야 운용마토바 류시게 류기 소와 지게 하고 용마토바 디용거레스 제산디네 자디 원보디게 도시는 냠르고 거레스 아니 디네암 도시네 지금 남사 잼바디게 제초쇼로 잼바 제초다 마잼바딘 제자다 원보 이기 원보서 대신 미다 밀어서 봤을 때 원보 미기 원보 내용 원보 제 원보 류기 원보서 원보 신나치 되네 쟁에 쳐봤을 때 이기 원보 이게 봐 냠로도 되네 냠마지 마잼바다 아니 직접 남사 잼바 제초쇼로 되네 용거레스 지산 투 지워서 뉴발 마선의 마충로거레스 지중도 지산 뒤소다 어당은 주기 괜레스.
The first part of this third point, the faculties deteriorate. So this referring to one's 5 sense faculties. The faculties deteriorate, such as your eyes and so forth, do not clearly perceive forms and so forth anymore. So this, too, we recognize that our eyesight fades, glasses become indispensable. Later, too, hearing fades, one maybe needs hearing aid. Taste is no longer as vibrantly perceived as before. So too, that's the sense of smell and touch. All of these fade and all of these fade or deteriorate and are no longer like they once were. But it's not only the 5 physical sense faculties that deteriorate, so too does our mental faculty. The strength of your memory and so forth diminish as you grow forgetful and so forth.
안도스네 가요 동아디게 되네 순고로 와다 되네게 세상 되네 자다 대수 안주게 딱게 뒤지게 동아세디 갈래 하고도 미도 아디 지간주디 먼저 하고 거로 와 삼사지 공부로 와데 디ken고 체도 마고 차도 와데 중원소미 통고래 근데 지게 ngo 당보 자가 나고요 바나게 지금 와서 자가고 차로에 되게 안내가 중원소미 통고래 안내 지금 예마도 등교디게 먼저 원소미 통도도아 제가 랑순년 바데 양아서 하고도 제가 대인가 주다 제가 안내 지금 또면 바데 마 되어바나 되네기 도시칼에다 야랑비 강아디게 데 용도 기시야당 되네마 경고차데 기시야래 갈래 가보다 파조 주급이야 마리쇼쇼 내 로고야 되네 강아디 요바데 또면 바데 양아서 하고도 와서 제가 하고 어디 통고로 왔다 가서 원소미데 내가 통고로 왔지 되네자 뒤지 동아세데 갈래 가보레세데 갈래 가보도 민도 와서 베전서 하데 뒤지기 동아식으로 왔다 가서 되데 dunga sumyana duji dunga de kale khasho res ya shigoro dine zada sina kale khabo de mindu ati zanze namza ha gudu wa sembege da de samsarwa.
So you may have a doubt, because a couple of segments before I mentioned that we need to utilize this presentation to come to know true sufferings, in particular the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, which is very subtle. You may think to yourself then, well, I clearly recognize that my once attractive body is in a process of decline. I can see this physical change. And I can also recognize that my power and strength is not like it once was, nor my my sense faculties, nor my mind. I see this process of change in myself as well as in others. So does that mean then I know this true suffering? Do I know all-pervasive suffering of conditionality? Surely this can't be so subtle, because I seem to have realized it already.
세상 한쪽에 하고 해도 라고 지우 통고를 라고마도 먼저 통고 말에 하고 말 세상에 니 하고 봤음이 뒤지기 동안에 하고 두고 말에.
So this is really an illustration of the difference between merely knowing something intellectually and having taken it to heart. So not having thought about it deeply, one has an understanding though, it's not hidden, but it hasn't transformed oneself. So therefore, one's understanding is still very coarse.
예상 디네게 삼다이도 다 디네게 다 나봉한 저기 다디 가외 중에 개와 슈더 고바스 마고 차그레 세디게 삼다이도 지사 다디디 경고 차이도 디네 슈더 차바딩 저기 미기 통고래 딩한중 없음 통고래 이내야 안디 남사 뎁직레 뒤질이 용바르에서 말을 와다 디네기 파 림바르바르바르바진 용교로와 림바르바진 용교로와 세상 디네기 다디 누신의 하고 요데 시대 구바 통일돼 다디 간스 용구도 선배에 삼야야 지도 두스 심주시 제지 제바치는 차차차차 삼당 당주고래 지난 디네자 디네기 참모디 하고 요도 어다 디네기 아주 류들라 닝보민도 선배에 삼게 류들라 차신디 용고 말 차신디 용고 말보다 디네기
So in the course level, we recognize the aging process. This is something we can directly perceive in terms of both our own lived experience and what we can see around us. This process, though, of aging, it may, on an individual level, be experienced as suddenly having befallen one. Suddenly one recognizes, I'm not how I once was. But the process comes about slowly. Each day there's change. But that change, one day to the next, is not recognized until it builds up to a sufficient quantity when we no longer are blind to what has been happening to us over a protracted period. So this we can understand, but we need to then look at this process of aging, recognizing it comes about independent on causes. So on a course level, these causes are known. But we need to look at the subtler level of causality or interdependence that leads to the aging process. And the purpose of this investigation is to come to recognize that our body has no essence. There's no essence in the sense of something that we are desperately trying to preserve. And the purpose of recognizing that is to challenge our attachment to our body, our attachment to our body.
Nadi yawo shingo sheba lang zuki dushi dunga de yawo hago la nyele mitaba de yawo hago or mitaba. Sinan zunyele ya de kebo chungye lam yirimbe shebe kabla ya mitaba chiwa mitaba sinde chiwa mitaba de rapare. Sinan chiwa mitaba de samda di tonen de ya samda de chagi mitaba chawa de sa chagore. Andi Nashin da din ma chido da nganzu da dunga di du samda de kabla da gyudan ki me bala chunga mare du sin ka re ngus beti sena du sin de anju gengo chae de kan cha gyu sin logic ne jigla da nganzu gengo cha de ni ge cha ro ba ha gu gu ro ba da nganzu da de ya simju samda de ge ji cha ba sin ne ma lo da da lo che ba na da lo ge lo di da su bu di gengo che cha ro ba ne ma de lo sha cha ro ba 어두 수야제네 되네 두신에 마 로직 삼단 되네 로직이 나올려야 다와 중요요래 다와 중요 삼단은 되네 다와 당부의 지 수보들에 다와 니비 수보들 경호 숙체 니바들 숨바들 숙체도 진로 야야 줘야 차고로 두스지게 나 다와 지래 니만 숨지 담을 지요도 니만 당부의 내가 유풍 수보들에 니만 니바 숨바도 진차도 돌돌돌 주고요 바디 두신 그거로 줘요 바디 니만 당보데 니만 당보들 주진 주섭시 삼당에도 다 주제 지기 내가 그게 되고 다 니바도 숨바지베 차에도 수보데 봐 줄줄 주고 저는 주제지 다 주제지래 가면 주주 파체 가면 주주 나래 나네 다 가면 지기 내가 그게 수보텔에 다 니발에도 봐 줄도 수수 주고 저는 두신 차차 삼당에 되네 완전 풍보지에 라니 줍점 니네 지게 기지지 뭐 신전도 유저바 니 유고여바데 하고 해야 돼 용거를 제가 차차도 수사 삼나요.
If one has so to come to know the suffering well, one should have reflected or cultivated certain causes. Particularly the reflection on impermanence, the impermanence of life. So that is the foundational meditations in the trainings shared with the practitioner of initial capacity. That having reflected well on that, now one builds on those prior meditations. And so having reflected well on impermanence previously, now we look at, in this case, the suffering of aging, recognizing how it comes about independence on a sequence of causes and conditions. When we reflect, we recognize, we take where we are now in terms of our current physical state, and we look back over our life and we can clearly see this process of aging. And we also recognize that this process of aging hasn't now concluded, it will continue. So we can, based on these years of aging that we observe, we can then imagine, so how is my body likely to be some years from now? And we recognize it will be actually quite different from how it is now. Then we shorten that future period and we imagine, let's say a year from now, how will my body be? And it will also be different, not as different probably as several years, but certainly quite different from now. And you break that further down to, say, a few months from now, a few weeks from now, and recognize that this process of change is continuous. My body today will be different tomorrow. And in fact, I can recognize that over the course of the day, my body is changing. And in fact, within the various periods of the day, say the hours, I can break this down further into minutes, into seconds, into moments, recognizing that there is no stability at all, despite how I relate to my body. There is no stability at all. There's this constant process of flux, which I am blind to. But because of this constant interaction of causes and conditions, there's a constant process of decline.
네 남산 깨진이바 차도 딜레 두르고 와다 깨지면 두르고 와 제사디 수부디 랑소디 직 격삼마도 땡아서 야고 예세디 격삼마도 남산 딜레도 두르고 래 깨진이바도 두르고 제사 되네자 깨지지야 수부 코로나 데네기 가서 류들이야도 samdam에는 제산 야고세디 람상 끼지치는 교어치는 딜도 주고요. 제산 데네기 깜찍이 내수 유엔 데네기 야고세 되게 내수시야 민도하대. 매번상 제사당은 주고 먼저 수고세야디게야 안직 끼지끼지를 봐 규제 당보다 오스 내니만 규로도 둘둘둘둘둘둘 주고도 와서 제사 데네 제사당은 류들이야 데네기 끼지까지 지랑 야고제 되게 뉴스시면도 왔어. 둘둘주도 왔어. 제가 데네 상도 류들이야 데네 닝보스가 민도 왔어. 제가 닝보 민도 될 이된 롱와 에 지우지 현자 지역에 가 민도 왔습니다. 닝보 민도 선배게 삼로디 디레토 거와 제사다 아젤에 안주기 풍보디 끼지기 집에 미다바 데네 유어줘바디 데데 가위기 괜디게 가위기 괜디게 데네기 끼지끼지마 지식 끼지치네 끼지 이번 파 가위기 동아디와디 규조고 바디 하고 하지 용거로 와 데네 하고요 좀 아니디 아니 보면도 선배가 될이야 아니 이로야 이 되어면봐 이 로네 딜레데 보면도 선배 현자 맞게 봐 용거래 세상에 데네자데 미다바 삼당 거래
This meditation here is taking us to the point of recognizing how our body is constantly changing. So this process of momentary change. And to recognize that this is in a direction of decline. The way we relate to this body, as if there's abiding, there's stability, is not the case at all. That there is this process, this ongoing process of momentary change. And the purpose of this meditation as presented thus far is to come to recognize momentary change so as to challenge our attachment to this body by coming to recognize that there is actually no abiding essence to grasp at, to hold onto as something that I don't want this to change. I want it to be wonderful like it is or what once was. So this is how we utilize this meditation on impermanence to come to challenge our attachment to our body. Because we are attached to our body in a way, we are attached to our body as existing in a way that it just does not. So we need to come to recognize that the way it exists is in this process of continuous change, of momentary change, and this is going in a direction of decline. And that then leads us to challenge this attachment. And that is part of the outcome that we're striving for in this meditation.
도시네 원비기 원보 주보디에이나 다케지 찌글린 람상 유르체네 지니 두르두르 교와주고요 바디 도시네 삼다데 케지 찌글레 다데니게 간젤레 안주기 류기 랑소다 안는 지게 데서 이나다 다 간제 안주 류디 유르디 케지 찌 까마페 뒤투노질야 당보디 유르첸 두르고요 바디 누구와래서 니 야고 자고 하고 거래 니네 하고 봐나 어떤 인보 민도 세비 될래 이때 다때 야고 빼 오래셔 삼백이 로데야 가면도 와서 제사대 인보 가면도 와서 삼백이 되네 될래 인보 매가 통고래 인보 매가 통나 될래 안탈되게 삼박이 거래 제가 배는 아주 잘라르시네 디 인보의 판도 민도 삼백 삼다나 디 냐야 되벌리고 말 화유샤에게 안지양한테 하는 유샤에 되벌리고 말도 냐야게 되벌리고 말 인보면 다양 아주 야보를 했으면 비제시라면 나때 야보를 했으면 소소지 현재는 바유마 배바 냐데 직냐니 비제시라면 되게 강반나라기 몽슈사데 거로다 디 제사딩한 저기 인보매가 통고 말디 야보도 섬 차신기리 될하디 거 차진면에 제가 오스요베네 다 베지미다 닝보면 판도면도 비삼비삼다나 거 바유샤데 밀제야데 지거로 제사 네 데니게도 진행하는 저 풍보래야 도시 닝보면 아주 다 풍보랑 하나 풍보 빼 차신 희우기거래 디게데 닝보 매바데 동고 말에 마통 바자 배 닝보 여바 삼다지 차선시우기 되거래 그래서 다도 기지 기지 당번이네 기삼이네 기진이바네 바 유르체 누르 여바데 하고 여도 셈랭 여바 템부신여도 되는 닝보 민도 선배 삼을 리거래 다 닝보 매바 삼 닝보 매바 통여도 되네 델레 타고도스 된 타는 딜레 야가 가르도스 디다 야시고도스 디토비하게 되게 리고 탈바등이 리고래. 진짜 디로래 잘라이네 닝보면 나디 야분에서 베게 야분매 바제바제 야하고는 디 베제 야분면스 바유 다딜에 야가디 가르도 세베 제시다니 리로와 어디나지 지바르다.
So in this reflection, thus far we've looked at 3 points, and all 3 you relate to the same process, to come to recognize their decline, and that this decline is momentary. So one looks at one's physical body, like in the first point, as well as one's power and strength. So just like with the physical body, that there is no stable abiding, so too with our power and strength. In fact, this too is reducing, and the reflection is the same. We look back over the course of our lifetime and we recognize this process of change in our power and strength, and we imagine how it will be going forward, and we recognize the ongoing process of change. And we bring it back to recognize that even on a momentary basis, there is no stability in our power and strength, just like with the physical body itself, the attractiveness of the physical body, the first point. So the reflection there is the same. And then so too with the third point about our faculties, our 5 sense faculties, our mental faculty, that there is this process of momentary change, leading to the recognition, point by point, that there is no abiding stability. And for each point as you go, you're repeating the meditation. This entire meditation is just presented. You repeat for the first point, the second point, the third point, coming to recognize that there is nothing worthy of being attached to, because there's no abiding essence that's worthy of placing this exaggerated value that attachment places onto our body, or our strength, or to the quality of our sight and so forth. So we're challenging the very foundation upon which our attachment is placed. This then means our attachment is reducing. And therefore, we start to relate to our body in a differing way, in a more realistic way. So here maybe I can draw an analogy to some possessions in your home, something that you're very attached to. It may be something you utilize a lot, or it's something that you don't utilize, but you cherish it. It's something that has sentimental value, so you squirrel it away in your house for safekeeping. But when you look at this with clear eyes and you recognize this value we place onto it is exaggerated, and therefore this is the mind of attachment, then we may still utilize it, but without that strong attachment. Or we may see it as actually not so useful, like we once believed, and think, I wonder if there's something better that I can replace it with. So this is how we change our attitude, by coming to look at in this case, a possession or our physical body in a more realistic way, in a wiser way, a more intelligent way. So then back to this, the reflection by each of the 3 points. Through recognizing momentary decline, we then recognize there's no essence worthy of our attachment, and our attachment fades. And we will rather put our body to good use, but without the strong attachment. And then we may well think about something better, about abandoning this body for a body that is liberated from samsara. And here the wish for liberation from this process of decline, from this suffering of aging, this arises. So this then is a further outcome of this meditation. Recognizing firstly, this process of decline through momentary change challenges this attachment that we have for our body. And then we think, I'd like something better. I'd like to be freed from this process of suffering. And we give rise to a wish for liberation.
그래서 내게 풍부 된 닝부 예비게 풍부에 가르쳐내 당한주게 라준바 톰나 내는 안라준베 톱지 라준베 유이다 요모모 바샤데 사원에 제바 방비고 된 톱디니 마 류닝보의 도르치네 야자 지켜와지네 야도 풍부디다 디다디 닝부 예바디레다 닝부 예바리다 가르쳐내 데 아니 유 메가소레 다디디 기회 동화다 가회 동화 디스 동화다디 뒤견디 매바래 제사다 내내게 꽤 매비게 풍부디다 탈바이고 뭐 톱나 디용고로와 디네자다 탈바 톱구도 생백다디 다디디 지 간에 삼다베네 코아딜레데 닝부 유니민도 매바즈다 코아딜레 타르시 탈바 톱구도 탈바 톱바이나 내내게 강한 용할 리디 용고 말했었지 디레다.
Just to first say as an aside, the word thus far, and not just in this teaching, many teachings, is translated in these contexts as essence or entity. Now it seems actually a more appropriate translation would be value. So I'm going to use the word value now, but related to what you often will either read or I would have said in the past of essence or entity in contexts such as this. But I'll use the word value now because it seems to be better. So when one has reflected in the way, now to what Genna said, when one has reflected in this way, one gives rise to a wish to attain liberation, freedom from the suffering, freedom from having that this body that has no abiding value, and rather gives rise to attain the state of liberation, whereby one does attain a body with abiding value. When one becomes an arhat, a foe destroyer, then one's body, because it has not come about independent on contaminated causes like our current body, the body of an arhat does have abiding value. It does have worth. Recognizing that that is possible, one then gives rise to a determined attitude to emerge from suffering, to attain liberation.
나데 다좀베기다 풍보티게네 베네 데니게 수고티 구고티게네 기지기지 주어주거서 주거래 기지랑 주선인데 기지니반 파주어주어와 지바랑 안저기 풍보티야 두텐데 기지니반 주어주어 기지주어주어 지바래 내 가르쳐버려 요래서나 다좀베기게 다좀어 톱네데네 안 제게 탈비고 뭐 톱선에 풍보티 저기다 하면야데 당보 탈비고 뭐 다좀어 톱 데네 톱니다 대시 당보토에 투자주모 토비의 풍보도 누구들에 교화줘야 누구들에 니파 공부 소개 양자 교화실에 풍보저로와 어디 나 사매기를 풍보저로 그래서 대 풍보텔라 기지기지 교화주고를 배수는 기지기지 교화주고를 그 믿어버려 요래 이나야 기지 당보대 니베도 둘 줘요 말해 둘 줘요 말해 시발이 기지기 교화주고를 때 약보지 버셔야 돼요 둘줘야 말. 당 안주 풍보대 당보대 야고여 봐라. 디니파 줄도 둘 줘고래. 어디 둑댕기 풍보들라. 다지 끼지끼지 지바래데 이내 끼지 균내 끼지 니바데 둘 끼지 니바들 숨바데 둘 숨바데 시바 둘도 센데네 안주게 릴이야. 아니 녀마두야다 자가버 차야다. 아니 지 기시 식 오버 메세와 차야디게도 수준 주고로 봐. 디 둘 주고 시선 둑댕기 닝보매바 되래. 다음에 다준배 파백이 데네 풍보되게 다 끼지끼지 유어도 믿어버려. 그거지 유어데 이나 둘 주고 말. 나마들에 이베데 둘 주고 말. 직바 연된 직바 차려야 봐. 어디 해봐요. 나뭐 뭔데? 디 조그레 디 둥아데 바르와 다 희산에 양게게월렘 풍보치여와 어디 디 풍보들다 미다바레 기지 요르고데 기지니바 당보들에 니베 둘줘요 말해서 왔다
in the life that a practitioner becomes an arhat, when they become a foe destroyer, their body, the body that they become an arhat in, is a body just like ours. It is a true suffering, in that it changes momentarily and declines or degenerates like our body does. So that's in the lifetime that the practitioner becomes an arhat. Then, when they die and are reborn, that body that they are now, this arhat is now born into, has not come about in dependence on contaminated causes. Whereas the body in which they became an arhat, that body had come about in dependence on contaminated causes. The new body, when after they've realized, become an arhat, died, and then been reborn, this new body that has not come about in dependence on contaminated causes, this is a body of abiding value, unlike all the bodies previous to that, which were true sufferings. So this body of abiding value has one thing in common with our current body, in that it is impermanent. It changes momentarily. But where the crucial difference is, that whilst the body of an arhat that is not a true suffering, that has not come about from contaminated causes, whilst it changes momentarily, it does not decline. It does not degenerate like ours does. So this is the crucial difference. And that is why this body is a body of abiding value, in that it is no longer true suffering. And whilst it changes momentarily, it does not decline.
to 공부 전에 양야 지켜와려도 대 다신 바뀌어래. 이 개월에 류디 다 가서 이기라시 류셔야 돼. 다신 기다 게 신의 다신 마도다 디르와 기 다신 세월 대시에 신의 다신 세월. 그래서 디 류디 다 가서 몰람다 개와 바실을 두드려 쳐거래. 개월에 된 두드려 쳐거래. 그래서 미가와다 레다 녀모벌에 기고마 주 거기 귤에 레다 녀모벌 요마래 매반자다 데 개월에 두드려 지자디니자 델이야 지게 디 루이디다 닝보 여바들이 데게디네 루이디리아 둥아 말 유에 둥아 요마래 아니 그런 게도 두신 루이디를 대신하게 먼저 지네 지규르데 갱고 차야로 제자 원부 미사와 차야 야디딘 마시에 귀엔디게 차가 매바르다 기회 동아디게 기회 갑래나 유게신 리고라디 기회 동아디게 매바레 안다디디 안주게 가위 동아디게 매바레 나위 동아 매바레 지위 동아 매바레 데네게 도시네 동아샤사 매바레 매반자디 데네기 루이디다 안주 고고하래 안주래 데네기 루이 톱나 땡이 데비 루이디 토고하래 진짜 데네 장 안주게 니 데네기 자좀 탈바도 톱나 아니 데네기 데네기 루이 토고하라 데네사 탈바고도 우세 제한테 된 얘기에 디리 제가 디네자 다데 안주 루이디 레다 녀모 원기 중화래 유 레다 녀모 원기 중화래 유디게 야고요 말에 유 레다 녀모 중화에서 먼저 기용되는 동아용 거래 아니 지금 마도 수수리 개로 개비 동아용 나비 동아용 거래 제가데 치위 동아다 말아용 거 지자디 율데 끼지끼지네 당보데 야고요 받아 끼지니 버디 딜레 두두두두 두고 거래스 제가 디네자다 닝부기네 민도아스 베게다 디네 다 디네기 델레다 녀모바 pombe 펑바 타르비 고바 토바이나 디네 안 타르비 고바 톰네 류디 데 안징잉보 여바 동어 류디에 이네야 안지기 베네다디시에기 기위 동아 가위 동아 치위 동아 세다 동아 탐제단 자되게 균 남제단 자와지 연대 포소 소고 예되게 류 토도아 제산디 류디 고고래서 지금 다 간질레 류디를 양안주기 데네기 균딘데 요 류직제 균 탐제단 데 류디제 세상 되는 인자 디니 가르 고구려 에센다 아주 균유게 리도 고매 세상 뒤티프 파더 다 균메 리 토고르 딩아 디고구도 세상 디고구도나 띵이 대화디 고고 디고구도 선배 세상 디 돈여게 토요 돈여게 좀 바뀌어와 디 돈여게 좀 바뀌어 봐이나 가르치르스네 디 토요게 탑람 배주 당요 배주자 람냠는 제대 용거로와 대용 봐이나 되네 규사 봐이나 제부 두고로와 세상 디 두고로와 디니게 다든 아주 균로지 균에 마통 반 만주기 류들이야 균 균에 마통 와있는 델레 탈비기 아니 류야고요 바디 탈 토비에게 탑시고 났던 거뭐 댕겨 말와 디니게 탑나 댕겨 말하면서 돈이게 좀 바기가 근데 게디나 아주 류디 균 류들이 균 마통 와서 대잖아 차지 게디나 디가 차는데 디니 코와네 마다가지 게디나 류다가랑 짠일렌디고를 근데로 강보들이야 차지 저희 맞다 게디나 강보 될게 두어 맞다 시잖아 강보야 두고말아 고딜 연대 삼 코라 될아 차되면 게디나 되되고와 아데티 균 강보 될 균 지지 야고면은 이 야고 차와 전부도 차 지 야고면서 비전 강보 되셔야지 한 강보 현다지 탑시 야진 두고로 안디 나시래도
Well, all of us sitting here, our body is a contaminated body in that it came about independent, uncontaminated causes. Hence, it is a true suffering. And hence, we experience suffering feelings. It's a basis upon which suffering feelings arise. And this has been the case for every birth that we've had and will continue to have. And even in the life where one becomes an arhat, a foe destroyer, even in that life, the body that one entered into that life was a contaminated body because the causes were contaminated. And then once one becomes an arhat, one's body is still a contaminated body. But when, for that arhat, unlike for ourselves, when death comes, the arhat will be born not from contaminated causes, like they would have been for every life up to that point. Now their rebirth will come about from uncontaminated causes and from prayer. So in other words, from virtue alone, uncontaminated virtue and prayer. So coming from their rebirth, coming from uncontaminated virtue and prayer, they take rebirth in a pure land. So their body is a body with abiding value or with essence. So it's a body with abiding value because it's a body that is not a true suffering. Therefore, it's a body that is not associated with suffering in any way. This arhat will no longer ever experience again the suffering of physical and mental pain, the suffering of transient happiness, or the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. Their body will not be subject to the sufferings of birth that we looked at 2 weeks ago, the sufferings of aging that we're looking at now, and the sufferings of sickness and death. They will never experience those sufferings again. Their body will change momentarily, but it will not decline or, as the text translated it, deteriorate. So this is the position for an arhat. Once they take rebirth, they have a body that has abiding value. For ourselves, just like for the arhat in all their previous lives, our body is contaminated because contaminated karma and afflictions were the causes that led to attaining this body. Therefore, this body is subject to the suffering of physical and mental pain, and we experience the suffering of transient happiness or pervasive suffering of conditionality, and we experience the sufferings of birth, the sufferings of aging, the sufferings of death, and the suffering of sickness, as well as the points covered earlier. There are 3 points thus far of the 5 relating to the suffering of aging. All of these we experience because of the causes that led to the attainment of this contaminated body. So through doing this meditation, as well as having this understanding presented now, one comes to the point of no longer wanting to continue lifetime after lifetime with this body that's subject to suffering and will always be subject to suffering because of the causes. One will want to abandon these causes. That then leads to the determined attitude, I want to attain a state freed from these causes. I want to bring about a cessation to having rebirth in a contaminated body. I want to bring about a cessation to my suffering. Thereby, one develops a determined attitude to train in the path, to cultivate the paths within, to cultivate true paths so as to eventually achieve true cessations. So this is the very purpose then of this meditation and all the meditations here, is to lead us to come to recognize where we are now, but that it doesn't have to be in this way. By accumulating very different causes, a very different result can be achieved. It would be like, for example, when you purchase a home and you're very happy, it's just fantastic, but all too quickly you notice faults with it, or it doesn't meet your needs very well, and it starts to degenerate, to decline, to deteriorate, and you now start to think about moving, getting a bigger house, a better house, maybe, or maybe now a smaller house, but needing to change it in some way. But how wonderful it would be to have a home that was always just perfect, that never needed any alterations or replacements, because it was sufficient in every way. That would be the kind of home we'd love to have. And this is through the meditation, the outcome is this determined attitude to attain freedom from our suffering state and a state of lasting happiness.
dele yaga chi tsegi donyer gi dumba de gi dala jin chi da sung hor wa chi da gyun ha ko ko re da de ji nga ju de ne ga yu du ne yu du gyun ya she da da ji sem ma ji wa du sam be ge sam ne ya ji ko gyo ma re ga jin di ga re se ne ko yu ni su yu gyun na gyun di ga ne chi ha ko ko de ge chen bo wa ha mo go yin zang an ju ge di na de le ya gyun tong go gyun ma tong de ge di na de le ya ya la di go wa ji da de di ro wa di ne za dang an ju ge gedi na nga zu lu le cha shen je de ne gyun ma dong za lu de gedi na da ba jin da shen je gedi na ning ba za chi mo shu sam da an de le ya ba cha shen shu ge ni de na lo song gyup je ne de na nga zu ge an ga che ore se ne ka sa ji gu ji cha shen shu ge yang de yue ba yin za su su lu de le ya an ji ji yan ma cha de ning ba cha de sem ne ma ji ba cha go la o de ne ning ba cha yan ma chen 또 내가 차용 선배게 셈리야 마기바 이미대와도 용거다. 제사디 이미대와는 셈 마기바래 강아지 거래. 제사다 아주 이미대와 얘기 견도 차고 가상도 주주나 손야 되게 준주나 손요도 이미대와디 견디 랑기 되어봐다 미디베게 자와 제바나 아니 이미대와 기리엘라로. 하나도 가지고서는 하나도 게디나 수보디 야보다 배지 유어마도 배지 야보지 고고로 되어 뒤로와. 지네 이내 수보디 코로 나 기기기 규르치네 닝바차도 둘둘로도 되네 안에 소소이 되바데 미디바데 내용지 제로와 미디발레 되네 마기바 차용이 되네 이미대와 기고래 이미대와야 세상 디디기리 세상 되네 인자 두시네 나서 하고고에도 예침바 차고로 바데 되네 용타데 세상데 하고에도 되네 차 두지네 기지기 삼다에 두jon데 되네 간삼 지글이야 아주 기지기지 바 다된 안주기 rākwa tākpa dīshē, dā dīni mā dō lōl pā shimchū lō nē dāwa nē nīmā nāla chūzē nāla kārchā samdā dū chē samdā, dīne ngā dzū kī phūngbō kē chōyā dī kē sē dī, phūngbō dī kīwī kīchik dāngbō nē nībāl pā gyūr chē dūr rūgō pā dā hākwa sō na, dīne dīrē dā, hākwa nē, dīne dū kīchik dāngbō kē sam nīne, kīchik nībā nē gyūr chē, kīchik dāngbō dūgā chī chāgō pā dā hākwa yō dū, 디시기 동아시아대 하고 거래 하고요. 되네 하고도 아다지 닝보 민도 되네 야고데 깨지지야 돼야 민도 와선비게 삼다 되네 닝보 민도 선배 삼무시 당 되고 그래서 다 닝보 민도 딜레데 타고 선배 삼다 데 타고 선배 삼도 다 되네 닝보 가서 다 타르바 톱나 다디 야고요 알아 풍보디 야고서 지 타르바 돈이 삼게 다 돈다라디 삼다디 타르바 돈이 가지고 누가 풍보라 꽤 마통 현상 안돌레 델레 타르게 삼바 기고 말 타르게 삼바 마기디 안돌레 타르바 톱되게 돈이 누바 기고 말 이마제 완상 타르베 람나 냠나 지고 말 그래서 두 삼다바는 류기 균 통화도 타르베 돈이 균 통화 차고래 진짜 균나도 두 차데 데네 삼노나라 게디니 아다데 최직 제호슨 델레 타르게 람 냠는 제호슨 베게 게디나디 삼노나라야 최지 해 삼노 리고하다 디 다등한 저기 뒤지기 동화세디 동화 임바동어 셈을 라트요도 데네 델레 타고도 델레 탈베 탈바 토데 데 토에 탑람 최 제호선배 데네 최제 삼로디 윤마체바지 지 용고래 그래서 디네 자디 윤마체바 용바나 디네 고냠는 제도 소리 야래 윤마체바 제도 야야야야 줘야지 타냐이 주로와 최제에게 최냠는 윤마체바 제도 디네 야야로 디네 탈바디 요가 토에 용고로 온도 시에 되는 자디 다 예천보다 상여점는 송고야 하나디로 동아 당번에 쉐순 동아 셰버자 세디 동아이 나네 뒤지기 동아디 하고 그래 세디 하고 그래서 하고 나디 되는 삼단 하고 그래서 이미 되와 이 미디어가 기획이 유디 가르스는 랑게 되바다 되바라 개체바 미디어가 중요하나 이 미디어 기계를 나르와 당한줄 가르 되바 여러서 한도 수보 빼 야고지 고고로 봐다 지선한테 야고 고고 되바 디어데 딜레 가시는 수보디 인과 차베 작가와 저 동랑녀와 차야도 셈마기 와이려고 봐다 지선 되니게 소식이 되비게 되바 딜레 독초질이야도 이 미디어가 기계로 와 지선한테 준준나로 써야 돼 그래서 단다지 봐 차고를 찾아
Last time, we looked at the first of the 8 sufferings, and tonight we've started or looked at most of the second, the suffering of aging. So the Buddha taught that sufferings are to be known. So these meditations, we need to engage in repeatedly over a sustained period, and in this way we will come to know these sufferings, which, as the Buddha said, is indispensable to give rise to a determined attitude to emerge from the sufferings of samsara and abide in liberation. So what's a challenge for us is to guard ourselves against the thinking, the way of thinking that is, of course, I recognize this. This is known to me. And that, as mentioned earlier, is the mere intellectual understanding. We need to engage in these meditations in the way that I've presented tonight, to the point where our way of thinking is transformed, where we give rise to a yearning for liberation, and that yearning is from deep within us, and thereby changes what we prioritize, change what we value, change where we put our time and our attention. This is when one can say, yes, these sufferings are known by me. So this is important. Otherwise, all too easily one dismisses this as, yes, I've heard this before, I see it around me, I'm experiencing it myself, and one's done, and doesn't give it any further thought. But to repeat some of the steps of the meditation, we need to go through these steps. We've covered 3 of them tonight, looking at this process of change for each of the 3 steps, looking at how we have changed over the last decades, over the last years, and then imagine the change that will come in a few years from now, and thereby we recognize there'll be also change in a few months from now, and recognize actually tomorrow will be different from today. Whether I can observe it or not, tomorrow will be different from today. And therefore, actually, now tonight is different from this morning. My body has changed in terms of the attractiveness, the power and the strength, the sense faculties and the mental faculty. There's this continuous process of change, and it is only in the direction of decline, of deterioration. We need to engage in this reflection so as to challenge this misperception of there being an abiding value to this body that is the basis for our attachment to it, and come to recognize that that abiding value actually is an illusion. It doesn't exist. The body doesn't exist in this way. What we are attached to is a quality it does not possess. Here, I want to draw a parallel to, or draw a link to what you're hearing in the Wednesday night teachings in the Patience chapter, where this is in the context of anger, that the mind of anger is preceded by a mind of discontent. It will come up, just to say as a translator, it will come up here in this text as mental displeasure, I think, or mental unhappiness. There's mental unhappiness, which is just a literal way to translate it. So in Wednesdays, they've been saying discontent or displeasure. This text will say mental unhappiness. That precedes the mind of anger. What it comes down to is that when we are attached to something, we want things to go in a particular way. And when they do not, we get upset. So either our wishes are blocked or things just do not go in the way we want them to, and then we get upset. So here, this mind of mental unhappiness comes about when things do not go as we wish. To challenge that, we need to recognize that what we are attached to does not exist in the way that we believe it to. This abiding value that we place on this body is an illusion. Hence our disappointment when our attractive body completely deteriorates, when our power and strength of our faculties decline, and when the power and strength of our body declines, and when our faculties, mental and physical, decline. Hence our disappointment, our yearning for it to turn back the clock. But this cannot be done because our body just does not exist in the way that we believe it to. The process of meditation, then I've recapped, where you're looking at each of these points, first in relation to the past and the future. That then leads to the point of challenging our attachment to this body. And this is, in that point then, this comes from recognizing impermanence. Then we challenge our attachment to this body. And then we recognize, but there is something better. There is something better. If I attain a body from different causes, I will not be subject to any suffering. Not only will I be free from the suffering of aging, but all experiences of suffering. Then we give rise to a yearning for liberation. Liberation from the suffering realms of samsara, recognizing that there is no body that one can take rebirth in anywhere within samsara that has an abiding essence. And thereby one gives rise for a yearning for liberation. This yearning for liberation is another way of saying a cessation to our suffering. And how to do so? To cultivate true paths, the paths within. That then is the outcome of these meditations. To get to such an outcome is when one knows suffering. To get there doesn't come about in dependence on hearing these teachings once, or even hearing them many times. One needs to hear them both many times throughout one's life and engage in these reflections continuously over a period of time. So in the same way that we're looking at this continuity in terms of our body, in this process of momentary change, going in direction of decline, so too is there a continuity in terms of accumulating a strengthening, virtuous way of thinking that comes about through doing these meditations repeatedly over a sustained period. So this is how we strengthen our continuity of practice, building on what we've looked at over the previous years, such as the impermanence of life, looking at impermanence in more detail now, and doing these same meditations every day, keeping them alive and fresh within us whilst we go about our daily activities. In this way, then, we come to build this continuity of practice within us. We come to know suffering, true sufferings, and in particular, all pervasive suffering of conditionality. So again, when the Buddha said true sufferings need to be known, he was particularly referring to the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. And this is how to use the various presentations on suffering to come to understand, to come to realize this most important and most subtle of presentations on suffering, all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. So the primary reason to realize that leads to realizing all-pervasive suffering of conditionality are these meditations on impermanence. So without knowing the momentary impermanence, the momentary change of our body, we will not realize impermanence sufficiently well to come to realize all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. We can come to a understanding of all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, but that will be very coarse. But to have the strength of realization that will lead to a transformation of our way of thinking, we have to meditate on impermanence, including the impermanence of this momentarily changing body. And then we'll conclude there for tonight, and we'll continue from the same place tomorrow. And thank you. Atisha? Show camera?
In relation to developing the state of an arhat, would it be logical for an arhat to immediately take death when they have attained the level of an arhat?
So would it be logical for an arhat to immediately die in the life that they become an arhat? So they gain these uncontaminated aggregates.
Lamsal keme beli tokuries. Lamsal shina rumaro sedida lamsa shina rumure sedi temi korongi che jior wada nyamagi jiwe che jior wada che pembadi mazo bado nyubadi madi sig marwa koran nyamagi gewangamagi 풍부기 렘비게 che denechi ne tuyegi 뉴슈 지어봐. 디 맞아 봐도 지금 말봐. 나 가서 쇠샤바는 시에인데 야 쇠나 디 디고 말봐. 랑게라서나 지금 말 미션다게 쇠나 디 말봐.
So whilst from our perspective we think that, say, suicide would be possible, it certainly is not, in the sense that this is non-virtuous, and a Buddhist or an arhat would not do something non-virtuous. That would be beyond the realms of, beyond what they would, something that they would even conceive of, either suicide or asking someone else to kill them. But so that isn't a possibility. So in terms of the natural ending of their life, well, that is determined by the lifespan within that their life has the potential for. So when one takes rebirth, one has the capacity, or one's life rather has the potential for a particular lifespan. When that's exhausted, death will follow for everyone. One cannot outlive that lifespan. So it will be the same for an arhat. When the lifespan with which they entered into that life is exhausted, death will naturally come. And that cannot be sped up. The artificial ways one would speed it up is not something that an arhat would contemplate.
ngāzu samdāwa nā oda dīni gā chūma shī sōng lamsā yī rāshī lū tab nā yāgu chāgwa dī yōgu shī shī nā dīsā samsā jī ngō rō wā dā ngā samdā dī kōgō rō wā yī nā chūma tōp chā nā kāngā dī ngāzu nāshī kāngā dī yōngā yō mā rō yōnggō mā rō kōrā chūma chirāgī kāngā chūma rō wā dā jidā phōngbō dī dū dī rē dī yī nā ngāzu nāshī jī kārsa nyō mō bā chā sā bā sā rō ngāzu kāngā chē mā sō dī nyō mō bī kī lī yō rō wā dā kōrā nyō mō bā sā bō nā chē bā bāng chā wā yin zā dīni kāyā yōngā yī kīn mānggō chī yō mā rā dā sūbī nē tāng tōne dō kōrōng yuwa nīng bī chāne dō sī yōnggō rē mā dō shēn dīni yō mā rā dēsā dīni yī sā dēlā yō mā rā kōrōng rā dā chī mō tōp tāng yōn dēlā yōgō shī wā yī dēlā sī kā yō mā rā dī kōrōng dēn dēlā yā mī kōrōng sō sā tīp chā pā jē yōnggō rā gōm yam nā jē lā nī yō mā rā wā ngā zū nā shīn kāngā nī yō mā rā wā kā sī kāngā tē yā kīn mānggō chī mē gā sō sā rā wā.
Your question, to be honest, it makes complete sense because from our perspective, we don't want to suffer. We want to have as fewer problems as possible. But for that new arhat, their situation is so remarkably different from ours, although their body is still a true suffering and will still continue to age and decline, they will not suffer in a way that we do. Why? Their afflictions together with their seeds have been abandoned because they are an arhat. So their lived experience is so different from ours because of having abandoned the afflictions and their seeds that it's actually not a burden for them to see out their lifespan.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
Wait, there's a further question at the back.
Looking at medicine today, which is a big factor in our everyday life, and and the growth of that as a wealth thing, and putting that into context of our meditation, how do we look at the medicine of today that's very concentrated on extending our life? Should we accept our fate? It doesn't seem right. Because, you lose your face. Should we accept that I'm not attractive now? That's not what you mean, I know. But we have all these other factors now where people are artificially if our mind is
Can I just ask, are you talking about your physical beauty or health, like staying alive? Okay.
Because our eyes are conducting that, from what we're seeing when making their judgments.
Okay.
But so therefore what I'm saying is, how does that fit in this big push in medicine and health that is happening today and increasing our life through technology and other things and drugs.
Okay.
Didire, Anzu Zawi Samno Nalia, Deji Sheba Nashi, doing all sometimes, don't that you may have tried it, Yesimbore. In that, don't that you will do some J anti young Kanjumanju Jena Digo Marwa. Chi saw the Tumbig Jawa Jehovah. The Anzu Subutila, Dawa Jawara, Mensa or Tuden Dengore, and the Machebaina, and the Durros Lamsa, and the Chetong Charge. Denina. Giving Yamlin Jella, Yunruva, go up Yunruva. She said, Dinza, on the Luta with Yahweh, Jesimbore. And in the Mune, Sigur, Shubanaji, and the modern English Madomena, modern English Yun Tona, Yun Tongo, Jesimbore, Yun Tone, the Saber head, delay pass, Saber egg, Tablam di Peshdi, Benjo Sawa, the Jesimbore. In a Tanga, the Nimbo to Dibejum, Savage Guins in the pipe, Nimba the Payusha, 먼저 사바사에 강한 먹고티 베지다 내가 줘야 돼. 강한 지선이 이 약고 다고 이제 인보 죄 뭐 통일통글에 다고 잡다디 가서네 디 안에 튕긴 주야야 판도고로와 디 베지 땅 베지다고 잡제 베지던 거 이렇게 다 이제 탑케 투지에서 탑케 가지고 디리 디나심 안주 류디드니 균 통일통글이야 인보 매바 하고 그거는 인보 예바디 약고 레게 된다래야 Dindelia, the Geshe Thubten Geshe Thubten Dindian, Yahore Majebena, Yahore Maton Majebena, then a Bajamangu Goza, the Tapo Yahweh, the Gesimore. The Gaos Gayamade.
So let's say you've got an old car, it's not so reliable, it really needs replacing. But you need to save more money before you can replace the car. So if one hand you said, this car's not so reliable anymore, I'm not going to drive it ever again, and therefore I can't get to work, so I can't earn a salary and earn a living. This would be going to one extreme. What the sensible thing to do would be to look for what the replacement car would be, see how much it will cost, and then continue to use your old banger until you've saved up enough money to buy a new car. So you'll be using the old car, your heart is set on the new car, but you'll be accumulating the causes so that you can eventually buy the new car, save up enough money. So in the same way, by doing these meditations, one comes to the point of recognizing that this body has no abiding essence and that there's something far better to come. So that the whole meditation and its outcome. But to actually achieve this final goal, I have to accumulate an extensive number of causes, which will take a long time. For that, I need to make use of this body. So then, now to directly answer your question, there are two aspects of that. One is about my health, and I need to look after my health using various medical treatments that are available so that I can continue to accumulate virtue. And I'm a part of society. So that's the one aspect, the medical. Then the presentation. I'm a part of society, so I need to present myself in a way that is in accordance with social norms. Because if I'm acting in accordance with social norms, but not in a way that's obviously non-virtuous, but acting in accordance with social norms, I can have a beneficial impact on others. People won't keep their distance from me because I'm not washing anymore, for example. So in this way, we go for a balanced approach. But what is important is in this process of meditation as described here, that one is looking honestly within oneself. And one isn't pretending in certain company to be this committed practitioner, but really that's not the case. So it's about being honest with yourself, sincere with yourself, and acting then within accordance with social norms and taking care of our health. So that individual balance will differ from person to person. And by looking honestly at yourself, you'll find your balance where that is now, and it may be different again in the future. Okay?
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.